Science at that point didn't acknowledge animals as sentient beings, so there's kind of that, you sidestepped that. We could say that they were, that they seemed to be frustrated, they seemed to be this, but we couldn't assign those emotions. So our records were public records, so we couldn't write down any assumptions of things that weren't based in science. So, but we didn't really see that trauma. We just didn't. Those animals were pretty happy. They didn't go through things. They were either born there, or in the sea lions case, and some of the others, but basically sea lions, which are my favorites, they're rescues. Their mom had been lost somewhere, and they were a beachy that had to be bottle fed, and at that point they're not allowed to be returned. So those would be the ones that came into our program, but they were so young, they didn't really know otherwise. So we didn't really see the trauma that we see with horses. This was a big hit for me that I didn't recognize, is how much trauma each and every horse brought to the equation, of one way, shape, or form. And let's consider there's the trauma that they experience. There's a trauma that their mom experienced and they grow up learning from, because they're vicarious or social learners. So as they grow up and mom's like, oh, shots are bad, and the baby's like, whatever that is, it's bad, and they do it too. They learn socially through what they see. So we have what they've been through themselves, what their parents have taught them, what their mom, not their dad so much, but what their dad has taught them, what genetics has brought to the equation. With the marine mammals, I thought it was all nurture, because we had very little real nature, that was without being, if a dolphin was born there, which we really tried not to do because there wasn't plenty, but their dad was there too. So you wouldn't know which is nurture, which is nature, because this environment was, I just thought it was all nurture. Then I started working with horses, and I'd work with, a young horse that never saw his dad, was just like his dad, and you're like, that's not, that they're just like their dad. It's not like, oh, a little thing. You're like, this was a genetic component. But then there's also epigenetics and things that can happen when the horse is in utero. The mom suffers trauma during in utero, or is traumatized even if it's having a lot of anxiety. That also affects the fetus. So we have a lot of layers and layers and layers that we bring to the equation through historically. This is how we've done it. So historically, we bring this kind of thing forward. So that was a big thing for me to recognize. So what we really kind of focus on, which each of you know, but we really focus on that emotion and the neurologic system of the horse. When they are in a place that is up and too much and worried, and whether it's pain, whether it's fear, whether it's, poor management, so they don't get to, get out and be horses and do what ethologically they should do. Struggled with that one a minute. We oftentimes can keep them rehearsing and staying in this elevated adrenalized state, and not being able to be relaxed and comfortable, and keeping them. We often historically have worked with horses far outside of their ideal state of learning. What we've done historically, again, I want to say this with kindness. Historically, what we've done is not been the greatest for the horse's emotional state. That's just, but this is all we had. We didn't know otherwise. So this seems all new, this positive reinforcement. There's one guy out there who kind of has his own following, but he goes, yeah, I remember when B.F. Skinner was all the rage. And I'm like, well, with traditional training, you're doing B.F. Skinner. You know what I mean? It's not like this is some separate thing. This includes negative reinforcement, but we didn't know the understanding of positive reinforcement. We didn't really know how to put into effect, or its efficacy with horses, because it's just not how it had been done. And I do attribute that a fair share to the history of, we needed horses to go to war. We needed horses to plow our fields. We needed horses to get to town. We didn't have the luxury of saying, Bessie's off today. Bessie's having a bad day. We couldn't. We had to go do what we needed to do. And so I think they became kind of these beasts of burden in our mentality, and we owned them and they served us, and we used them, and we did these things. And now, as things are changing, we're kind of realizing they really are partners. they really are, it does matter how they feel. But what we also know, and I think that for a fair share, what happens when we start to work with the horses with positive reinforcement, we start to give them a voice and we say, we're listening. And they kind of go, yeah. And sometimes they go, yay, great, I'm all in. And sometimes they go, well, then no. And they can say, I don't want to then. Now we look at that and we know that that's just a temporary phase that we're going to get through. That's part of them getting their own voice, is them having the agency to say, I don't want to, or I do want to. So that's all okay. We have ways through that. You know what I mean? So if that happens, there was somebody in Las Vegas, and I was hired to go. I was working in Northern California for this gal's kind of in that private sector, and she had a horse she had rescued but was with somebody, and this woman had me basically now on her payroll. All she wanted was positive reinforcement. She was kind of an extremist, but it was okay. But she had her friend who had these horses that she had rescued, and she wasn't using positive reinforcement. So she wanted me to go get these 4 horses. But, and they're friends. So now you're like, great, now I'm in the middle of you two warring factions. So I go up to get the horses, and I'm there for a few days to work with the horses. Well, now I'm saying I would like them at liberty to get on the trailer and off of the trailer for a few days without any. And this all went well for 3 of them. One of them turned into, she said, a big fat no. And no with panic. It wasn't like, and so, you're kind of trying to give her time. The first ones are all trepidatious, but then they just got more calm and confident. You're like, you 3 are fine. But this one mare, she was saying a big fat no, and it was getting louder. As she realized I can say no, then I am saying no. And the woman then said, well, I can load her in my trailer. Now I'm thinking to myself, and I'm communicating with the owner all the while, because she's down in, Northern California or over wherever. And I said, okay, this, okay, that. And I said, okay, I would like to get the mare on the trailer any way we can and get her to you so we can start clean, because she is traumatized big. But she said, well, I can get her on my trailer without, I can get her on my trailer. And I said, okay, let's see, let's see what that looks like. Thinking well, then she took her horse over to her trailer, which was just parked in a different part of her area, and the horse was rearing. And she said she's never done that before. See what clicker training's done for my horse. Now, this is kind of how it can go, that people then say, see what you've done. But we haven't done anything but given her a voice. She was shut down about that. She felt that way all along, but she just thought, I just have to get in, because what happens next is worse than getting in. But that trauma, as much as we can use equipment, we can use methods that kind of take away their agency, their voice, their autonomy. The more we do that, the more that we can have them complying, but not wanting to. So that's when people say, get a bigger bit, get a tie down, get a draw reins, get use a that. And what we're doing is we're really kind of hiding how they really feel underneath it all. Because in there, they feel the same way they always felt. They're just learning, I don't dare show it, because we have equipment or methods that can make it a little more coercive than that. So that's just kind of a good example where she said, see what it's done to my horse. And you're like, well, actually, but in the big picture, you're like, it's progress. To see her say a big fat no, it seems counterintuitive, but it is progress, because now she can tell you how you feel. And now that she can tell us how she feels, we can go, well, then we can help you with that. Let's back up and find a place where we can work together and where we can slowly learn that feeling. Now, some of you have heard me tell this story about the example of flooding, but you're going to hear it again for some of you, and some it may be new. But the flooding is something that we do quite often in the horse industry, and have done quite often in the horse industry, because we didn't know better. And flooding would be an example of a stick with a bag. And we've all seen that, the flagging, the bag, and that what we do is the horse is often tied or held or in a round pen where they don't have but so much getting away. And then the horse is afraid of the bag, and it continues until the horse stops showing the fear of the bag. So oftentimes people walk away and say, oh, good. Look how much better he is. He's better about the bag. He doesn't care about the bag anymore, because now we have a lack of showing the response to the bag. But really what typically is happening there is something called flooding. And flooding is, it goes through learned helplessness first, and then it goes in the flooding first and then results in the learned helplessness. So they're overwhelmed by this stimulus they cannot get away from, they cannot get it to stop. So finally they realize all my energy in the world is doing nothing. So I'm not putting my energy out. And oftentimes it's because they're too tired at that point. Now they're on the edge of exhaustion. And some horses have actually gone to exhaustion. And I know of some trainers where horses have died in their care. And so because they've continued until they just, couldn't handle it. And so and now the result is we're trying to get desensitization. We're looking and we want the horse to feel like, okay, I'm okay with that. But oftentimes, and at the best case scenario, we're going to get habituation, meaning they kind of go, okay, I guess it's okay. That doesn't happen as often as we like. Habituation would more often be, okay, this is Anne's place, but there's a train that goes by, every 4 hours, but it's at the end of the property. Now the horses have escaped from it, but they're exposed to it over and over and over again. Pretty soon they're probably going to learn, okay, I can escape, but they're going to learn, okay, that train over there is okay. That's going to be habituation. Doesn't mean they like the train, but they've realized, okay, I can tolerate the train. But there's a lot of there's freedom in that, because they can move away from it. It's not saying you're stuck in this environment. If you put them in a little round pen right next to the train, now you're probably going to be flooding them. So flooding is they cannot get out of the environment. So now what we're looking to do is desensitization. Oftentimes what we're truly doing is creating sensitization, because what we've done is taken away their ability to escape, their ability to tell us how they feel, and us not listening to them. And we have overrode it till they're to the point where they're like, all effort is not worth it. We've flooded them with this too much. And then they go into learned helplessness. Now they think, I fought and fought and fought. I'm just going to stop. And so they quit trying. But inside, what they've typically done is learn to shut down. They've learned to go away, to disassociate, to go to do different mechanisms that is just trying to escape that. I often talk about me as a child growing up, and I was sexually abused from the time I was 3 till I was 16. And what I learned from that, I got into learned helplessness. This is what I did. I learned that I can't stop it. I told my mom when I was 4 years old, and and the resources weren't out there at that point in time, and it wasn't listened to. And because she listened and went and talked to my stepdad. My stepdad said, that's ridiculous, blah, 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 blah. So at 4 years old, I thought, I went to my resources. And my resources I was 4, I could barely speak, really. And so then at that point, there was no other resources for me. So I went into learned helplessness. And this is where, when I would go to my granddad's farm, which was a hobby farm, and we went to when I was with my dad, because my mom and dad were divorced then, we would often go to my granddad's farm, and they had what they call good horses. And those horses were safe as all get out. Little children could hang on their legs, and they would not respond. They would not do anything. And so they were safe horses. But one day when we were trying to get the horses, because every time we went to the farm, they lived in, 40-acre fields. It was a 300-acre farm, so it was big. And we would have to get my dad's saw, because my dad was a hippie. And so we'd get the saw and go round them up, And so that's what we do. Well, one day when I was about 6, I realized they don't want to be caught. They're trying really hard not to be caught. If they like this, they wouldn't be trying to avoid what we are bringing to the table. And I didn't know the words. I didn't know I related to this, but it made me very, very uncomfortable. And I thought, I never again, asked for them to get the horses for me. And I made a decision, I'm not doing it. My cousins would come down and want the horses caught, and so I would interact with them then, but I would never have somebody catch the horses. Now, I was in my 40s when I recognized I was seeing myself. This was learned helplessness. I didn't realize, but I felt like we're imposing ourselves on them, and this is uncomfortable for me. So I think that it's important to recognize, you know what I'm going to say right here and now? My mom and dad were not monsters. My mom and my stepdad, they were not monsters. They were doing what they knew, which was dysfunctional. It was harmful. It wasn't good, but they loved me, and I loved them in this. Now, did it do damage? Yeah. I have lots of dysfunction, yay, but yay me, but so do our horses. And I think it's important that we recognize people are doing the best they did with the tools they had. You know, so as we look at people, because sometimes we see things, we're like, you know, what is happening? Sometimes going to shows or working with show people, you know, there's times you're like, how can you be this removed from the emotional state of your horse? You started loving a pony somewhere, but it is all they knew, you know, and they're doing it with the best intention. So I want that to be brought forward, that we have empathy and compassion for the people that are doing things that sometimes really abrade us, so that we kind of recognize it's not done with ill will. It's not, but it's just what we knew. And now that we know better, we can do better. So I think that was an important component to add into that. So this is where, yes, Anne.
I have a question. You were talking about, and I understand the idea of shutting down. Is that one element? Does that lead to potentially trigger stacking, or are they so shut down that it doesn't add into the potential of trigger stacking?
I think it can lead to, and it's a good technical question, but I think a shutdown horse can still go into, I think if they're dissociative, where they are, I emotionally and in all consciousness basically go away. Like I just like, you're not here, I'm not here, we're not here. I think they're probably canceling out the things the triggers that would happen to pile up. But I think a horse that's shut down because with me being in the learned helplessness, it was in regards to that area of my life. In other areas, I didn't walk around all my days, you know, I seemed like life wasn't there. In other ways, I was very dysfunctional. I didn't have, you know, anyway, the defiance disorder or anything. But I think that there's a lot of ways, but other areas I might be more sensitized, and I definitely was hypervigilant. And I still am hypervigilant. I have tendency to take in a whole lot of information that I don't need. It's white noise. But I went around in this, I was in charge of my survival. So the 4-year-old me, who had no skills for any of this, was like, I got to look out and try and figure out what I can make sense of. So I know that there can be a hypervigilance, which is going to create more sensitivity to things. So as we kind of process through it, I think that if they have dissociative, you know, going away, they probably rule out a lot of the triggers. But many horses get extra sensitive to other triggers. The story I use a lot of times, the analogy I use is, if I don't like spiders, and now we'll say I don't really probably like scorpions much either. I've seen them in California, so it's not, but anyway. So arachnids, I would rather not. But so we have, so I don't care for spiders. I know that spiders are good. You know, spiders do good things in this world. They eat bugs. They're not outgoing, you know, they're not working against me. They're just spiders, but they give me the heebie-jeebies. And so I'm kind of like, okay, just, you know, I'll be like, I've had them in my bedroom and me think, I'm okay as long as I can see you. Just stay there and you can be my roommate as long as you stay up there in your realm and don't come down into my bed. And so anyway, so I get it. My rational self knows that. But there's some irrational self. And you know, it's going to be an interesting part of this. When my mom was little, her dad, I think he was in the war somewhere, you know. I think he was like D-Day over Normandy and stuff, but he had a tarantula he got from like a banana boat, and he brought it, and I think she got a fear of spiders from the tarantula, which I think I grew up with this fear of spiders, not even knowing why, but, you know, just kind of that, you know, vicarious or social learning. But anyway, so I've never liked spiders. So let's say Jessie says, it's time to get Shawna over her fear of spiders. So, but she doesn't say this to me because we don't have a spoken language at this point for some reason. And she says, Shawna, will you lay down in this box? And I say, okay, it's Jessie, sure. And I lay down the box and she straps me on in and I'm like, weird. I'm like, Jessie, what are you doing? Well, now we're not communicating. I can't tell what she's not able to communicate what she's doing or why. So I'm just, all bright-eyed, like, okay, it'll all be good and optimistic. And then here comes a front loader full of spiders. And then she dumps them in the box with me. Now, I don't know if there's black widow in there. I don't know if there's brown recluse or whatever, weaver spiders or whatever horrible spiders are out there in the world. And so I don't know that, but I know I don't like spiders. So I am just fighting. And she goes away and leaves me swimming in this, and just my face is out. And so she goes away and she comes back later and I finally stop moving. Now I'm just sitting there. She comes back later and thinks, oh, good, she's over her fear of spiders because look, she's still. And so she gets me out of the box and I, go away and, have much trauma from that event. And yet her intention wasn't to be bad. And then she goes on her way. And then the next day she says, hey, Shawna, will you sit in this chair? No, nuh-uh. I'm not sitting in the chair. I'm not going in the room. I don't trust anything you say because I believed you and it went very, very wrong. Now she can say, but there was no poisonous spiders in there. Nothing was going to hurt you. It was my reality was that was a terrifying event. So I think as we sometimes go, it's just a flag. To them, it's not. To them, it feels like life or death. And so we need to recognize this is their reality. And I appreciate that that's how you feel. So I'm going to listen to you and we're going to sort this out together. So that would be flooding. And the result of flooding is a sensitivity and a mistrust of Jessie and all that she brings to the table. It becomes bigger and bigger, and actually it can become distrust with the world. So that hypervigilance has you looking for danger everywhere you go, and that is a common byproduct. So now let's say on the other hand, Jessie decides to do it a little different. She says, okay, Shawna doesn't like spiders, I want to help her with this. So she brings out a tarantula in a glass box and sets it on the table and says, Shawna, can you just look at this spider? And I say, yes. She goes, great, here's $30. I'm like, oh, okay. Then she goes, that's it, takes the spider away. And I'm like, okay, no harm, no foul. And I go on my way, and then the next day she does it again for a couple days, and then pretty soon she says, can you take 2 steps to the spider? Yeah. Now what she's doing it in a systematic way. Systematic desensitization paired with counter conditioning. This is the use of the food. By giving me, or the money. For me, it's going to be money. She says, well, it would be food too, but I can buy food. So if she said, okay, now I'm going to give you, so now I'm going, well, I get money every time I do it. She's starting to change how I feel about the arrival of the spider. Now, first, it's literally, I'm doing it because I want the money. I'll get closer because I want the money. Pretty soon, I'm like, hi, spider friend. Because, okay, here's a good example of a conditioned reinforcer in our world. It's money. Okay, because money, frankly, is just paper. But so if you're going to a desert island, somebody said, what do you want to go to the desert island? You're not taking money. The money is nothing there, unless you're going to use it to start your fires. But you'd want firewood and clothes and shelter and food, and you wouldn't want money. But money in our world it represents our safety and buying the things that we need. So money, and if you see $1 on the ground, I don't know about you, but if I see $1, I'm like, that's $1. It triggers something in me that is a different kind of reaction than a piece of paper on the ground. Like I recognize the elements of it and what that is. And think about it, $1 doesn't even buy anything these days. But it's still, the dollar creates that feeling for me. And do we work for just enough money to survive? Nope, we don't. We work for we want more money than that. And that's kind of part of playing that game. But that's a conditioned reinforcer in our world. So if she's using a conditioned reinforcer to change my emotional value of the spider, well, pretty soon she's like, okay, can you come up? Can you hold the box? Pretty soon I'm like, yeah, I can hold the box. And maybe I do something good and she gives me $50 that day. And then, she goes back to, that was good. And then we go on our way, and then pretty soon it's a screen on one side, screen on the other side. And then she's holding the spider, and she says, can you hold the spider? And pretty soon, yeah, I can hold the spider. But we've done it in incremental ways where we've given me choice. I've been asked if I can do it. It's been very systematic. I've got a chance to associate. I've got a chance to create better associations with it. So that is systematic desensitization with counter conditioning, which is a much better way than flooding. So it's all this to kind of say this is some of the trauma we unintentionally create because we didn't understand these pieces in the horse world.
Can you explain then how it's not bribing?
It isn't? I'm just kidding. Now bribing would be, okay, now I think there's two components to the bribing. The bribing is oftentimes when we're bribing, we're using it in a coercive way. We're saying you're not going to get your food unless you do the thing. I have this value and it is not yours to have. And we're saying, here's the money, come, and then what you're doing, I'm focusing on the money. I'm going to snatch the bill and try to run. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to cognitively thinking, I need to do the behavior in order to get the food. But in the very beginning, is the correlation, I'm doing it for the food? It is. In the very beginning it is, because we're using something that the learner, whether it's a sea lion, a human, a horse, that they find salient. So we're using something that they value to begin to give value. So it is the food. It isn't the clicker at first, but pretty soon we use that Pavlovian conditioning, that classical conditioning, and we click, we feed till the click holds the value of the food. And so now what we're doing is we're giving a secondary reinforcer. We're bringing that into the equation. And this also helps break down that distraction of the food. Because if we're going and saying, and this is the target, frankly, can get to a point where it's too distracting. Our hand targets can be too distracting because they can be the thing that they see. Sometimes with the target, well, in the beginning, I was like, oh, we need target. And then I realized, wait, everybody is so reliant on targets, they're not fading the targets, years and years ago. And I thought we shouldn't be reliant on targets because the targets can actually overshadow the behavior we're looking for. So if she's saying, I want Shawna to look at the spider, I want her to think cognitively about the spider, and then she starts holding the food up, or the money up, and I'm not even thinking about spider, I'm still worried about the spider, I'm just trying to snatch at the thing I want. Does that make sense? And it feels coercive. It doesn't feel thoughtful or cognitive. It is a different kind of mentality for it. It is the systematic approach to the behavior. I told you guys that, or some of you know, that when I first looked into the horses from the marine mammals, I talked to Grand Prix show jumpers, and because I saw a Grand Prix, and I was like, wow, that's incredible. I saw a lot of stressed horses. I did not want that. That's not what I wanted. But I saw 2 horse and rider combinations, and I thought that it looked like a walk in the park. It looked easy, breezy, fun, and I was like, that's what I want. And so I looked into it, and I was talking to show jumpers, international show jumpers. I was hearing horses aren't smart enough. They can't do it that way. That's not how horses learn. That's not how horses. Even one of the people that was one of the good combinations didn't get it. He didn't even know what he had. You know what I mean? He didn't even know why he had it or why they didn't have it. But and he didn't use positive reinforcement, but he was very mild with his, anyway. So as I looked, yes.
Can I go back before you go?
Yes.
I have one question before you go on. I don't even know if I can articulate this
Okay.
well, so you might have to help me. But when you're talking about flooding and seeing other people who are flooding and things, I've run into situations where I had someone say, oh, you should take your horse in this parade and you just do this thing, or right? And I said, that seems like a lot of work, to get him to be able, it's not what I want to focus on.
Right.
And she goes, well, I just take my horse in, and he's just like, oh, he's just fine, and he does nothing. And I said, well, that sounds like flooding.
Yes.
And she goes, yeah. And I said, well, that's not really what I want for my horse. And she stopped for a second, and I realized what was going on is she actually believed, having been a dog trainer for a long time, really early on,
Right.
in the 80s, and where, we didn't have all the same science, that flooding was a part of training. So for her to hear me say, that's flooding, as if that's not training was almost like she couldn't comprehend it.
Right. Like, you don't know what you're talking about is what she probably thought.
Yeah. And then I had another situation with a trainer who had showed this, horrific video of a horse that wasn't picking up their feet and being really, dangerous about it. So she hired somebody to basically do that thing where they tie one leg up and then they poke at them and they have to hobble around until they, never want to put their foot down.
Yeah.
Whatever. And she said, before anyone says this is horrible, tell me what you would do different. I'm like, because you said, I wouldn't have raised my hand otherwise, but since you're asking. And, of course she got very defensive and it was positive reinforcement. You're not working with dangerous horses like this. And I said, this is the problem, this is flooding that turns into learned helplessness, and that's not training. And I feel like some of these techniques have seeped in, been labeled training, and people are having a really hard time separating that that's not training.
Right.
But I don't know how to even break that down for them, because saying that's not training is still like, I feel like that's a big gap for them to go from here to there.
Yes.
So what would be a way to explain why that isn't training?
And in a
Even
way,
if you're using negative reinforcement, I consider that training.
Right.
But you go into flooding and learn helplessness techniques
And
like
punishment
that's not
and
training
trauma, yeah.
anymore. So how do you explain you've crossed a line that's no longer training when they keep getting told, yeah, this is training. This is a
And I
part of
think-
training."
But it's also getting yourself along.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And I think to a certain degree, they could call it training because they're just getting the results they want, not by any ethical methods. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's not training in our way. And I guess it really would define, what do you consider training? And so that's what I might.
Abusive training.
Yes. I think I would ask them, well, what do you consider training? So have them kind of evaluate that, and what kind of relationship do you want with your horse? And then I'd say, and they're going to say lovely things. So and then what I would also do is talk about the ramifications of what they've started. That horse is going to be either so shut down that they're going to be short-lived ulcers, but they're also going to be dangerous in a lot of situations if they don't just turn flat out aggressive right out of the chute. Because like 99.9% of aggression is all fear.
Right.
So I think that it turns to that place. So I think that just trying to help them to understand the science, because the science doesn't support what they're doing is the best way to do it. But yet people oftentimes, and this is where Jesse brought up the bribing, but people oftentimes go, I don't want them doing it just for the food. Well, they're either doing it just for the food or just the avoidance of a trauma, something that they do not, an aversive. I mean, so they're doing it. There's always one or other at play. There's always a reinforcer at play, and all behavior serves a purpose. So I don't care what the behavior is, it all serves a purpose. So if your horse, and here's the difference with, and you kind of know this, I mean, you know this for sure. I'm saying, well, I'm not telling you anything new, but you guys, a lot of it, you do know it, but some of you might be new too, or just a rethought of something you knew, and sometimes I think I've forgotten more than I actually remember. I'm like, oh yeah, I wrote that in my book 30 years ago. But anyway, I think that as we kind of recognize that I forgot where I was going with that now. But I think it's the ethical component where you get them to the ethical point and thinking about, because the science supports what we do, the things they do. If a horse with positive reinforcement, and this, you have to educate people about this. If here's a horse we worked with in the one that I talked about, and that we just worked with in Florida, and she was a fancy hunter, lots and lots and lots of money from her owners and the horses around her and where she's showing, and they, but this horse wouldn't do it. She would just be spooky, and she was spooky at things, and she wasn't really spooky. The reason she was spooky is because she was avoiding, or she was, kind of just on high level alert. So she's trigger stacking, and this is too much, and this is too much, and everything was just, and instead just listening to her person. So that as we got through that, as we started working with her, we work at her at Liberty. Well, what did she do? In the round pen, which she had some round pen work, but not a lot, So some horses, you take them in the round pen, they'd start running. You're like, okay, I know what you think. But this wasn't that case. She just went in and she would just engage. We take her to the paddock. She'd work do like 2-3 approximations, she'd leave. She did not like not knowing the answer. Not knowing the answer was scary for her. So what would that look like if we were doing something under saddle where and they're getting, bigger bits or bigger, spurs, whips, whatever to get that job done? It's going to get more reactive and more reactive and more dangerous. When she could walk away, it looks very passive and it doesn't look like the fight that people are expecting to see. But that was just as big a no as the rearing. You know what I mean? So it can manifest in a safe way. And if we're paying attention, we're like, I hear you there. So then then she turns a corner fast and she's going great. And then we asked her to do A to B's over a ground rail. Went back to, she was doing great, doing A to B's, doing all great, doing A to B's, and then we asked her to step over a ground rail, and she's like, nope, because it showed her emotions there. But again, it's showing when they have the choice to show it. So I think I'd go back to them and say, but this is the science, and say, this is what kind of relationship do you want? Because people are going to do what they've always done. Where as much as positive reinforcements gets accepted, we're always going to have people who fight against it. And we went and did an expo, and it was, when I did expos years ago, I was on that circuit with John Lyons, who I loved. He wrote a little thing for my book. I love John Lyons. He's really, what he did was different. People kept saying, you're just like John Lyons. And I was like, who is this person? And so we went to a clinic of his, like with 700 people there. And I could see why they would say that, because the outcome was the same, but the methodology was different. But nobody knew the methodology that I was doing yet. You know what I mean? But I loved him. So he was on the circuit with us, and he's one who sat down with me and said, well, what would you do if this? And what would you do? And it was very clear. He went back to his horses, and Zip was one of them back then. And he tried the positive reinforcement, but he didn't know what to do once he hit here. But Pat Pirelli was, not really a known thing yet. He was just starting to be, and so he was on circuit. Clinton Anderson was on that circuit. Monty Roberts was on that circuit, and Chris Cox was on that. I mean, it was just, and nobody. You'd be kind of friends with some, that to the degree you could. Some people just weren't my kind of people. Period. That had to do with. But like John, I just adored. And I think he's the best. He's a really great teacher. But and nobody got on mic and said, this is what you get with clicker training. This is what you get if you use feed, blah, 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 blah. Well, a few years ago, Jesse and I were doing an expo that I'd done also years and years ago. And people that were there with us working came up and said, people said that with this, using food, you get this. With the clicker, you get this. And I said, well, that's progress. And everyone's like, what? Because they were all mad. And I said, well, now there's cognitive dissonance. People are like pushing against it. It's encroaching on their environment, and now they're fighting it. So I think the bigger it gets, the more resistance you have in that process. So does that answer the question at all?
Because at first people just dismiss it.
Yes, at first they're like, yeah, whatever, crazy whale lady. You just go do your thing. Yeah. And I'm sure that people came to my demos at first because they're like, this would be interesting. You know what I mean? I was kind of a sideshow circus because as a marine mammal trainer, like in the picture was a picture of me and a whale. So I'm sure they thought, okay, interesting. And then we have our horses there, and they're like, Cowboy came up and said, I want my horse to be like that. I was a whale, okay. Might get rid of that belt buckle. But you demonstrate with your horses, and then they think there's something to this. I might not be ready for it, but there's something to it. There's a time when I was it was a Midwest horse fair, and this gal came with her husband. It was my lecture portion, and the husband clearly didn't want to be there. He had his big old cowboy hat and his big old buckle, and he was doing and his pressed wranglers, and he came in there. He let me know from the second he walked in that room. He was mad he was there. And so they sit down together, and he kicks his feet out, and pushes his hat down, like I'm going to sleep for an hour. And then, you know, his wife's all, you know, listening. And so you just start talking and talking about the things. And knowing that I have that guy in my audience, I use a little more science because science speaks to men a lot. And so a little bit, well, pretty soon he's sitting up and his hat's back and he's doing that. And he do it. At the end, I finally say, does anybody have any questions? His wife raises her hand and he swats it down and raises his hand. So, you know, if they'll listen, we get there. But I think that the understanding that it is, we're always going to have people that resist it. The bigger it gets, the more they're going to resist it because it makes them uncomfortable. And the cognitive dissonance isn't even a conscious thing. It is a struggle between what I do doesn't agree with this, and so I'm going to have guilt or a lack of monetary funds or something. I've committed all this time to this, and now I'm going to be a beginner or whatever. So they can struggle against it. So I think that I agree with you. It is not really training, but I think they could argue that they got it done. It's unethical and abusive training or one-sided. So I would go back to, and if I had a group of people and I think that person who just said this is never going to be swayed, because I think this is important for you guys to understand, because there's going to be times you're out there trying to teach something and people are going to be saying, no, this is not, you know, what you're doing is blah, 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 blah. But I would just say, I would then pose a question to get the other people thinking, you know, and say, well, I guess getting something done, but, you know, what would be your definition of training, and what kind of relationship do you want in the training? When we have a client who feels a little touchy, you know, you're like, they're going to swaffle back and forth. A lot of times saying, what kind of relationship do you want? Oh, they give you the most beautiful definitions. And they think they have it, frankly. And then you're kind of saying, see that? That's actually, she's walking away, you know, and you have to, but they're, so, and then when they're kind of like, well, I just want to do this, you go, okay, well, what do you think that would do for your relationship that you want to be full of trust, you know, and then they kind of have to feel their words again. And a lot of times, so that's what I would do. Or then the question of, well, what's in it for your horse to do a flying lead change? Oh, nothing? You know, I think.
Or go in a parade.
Yeah, or even go in a parade, exactly, because it's super flooding. And how many times have you heard people say a horse goes to a new place and for the first few weeks, the horse is good because the horse is flooded. And the horse is like, I don't know any of this stuff. So the horse is good because they're overwhelmed by every single piece of that place.
Or they were consistently flooded at the last place, and now they have a little bit of a voice, so they're starting to show their actual personality.
Yeah, and even a horse is just regular training, you know, and they come in, you know, at, you know, New Mexico, you know, imagine he come in, next thing you know, he's, you know, he was good at first-ish, and then, nuh-uh. So, you know, we can have then they light up once they kind of start taking in the pieces and get that.
So this flooding thing seems to work, you know, for
Okay.
a lot of horses. And some horses turn aggressive, but that's not the norm.
But
Really. But there are also horses who they shut down and then they explode. Like
Yep.
I had one when I first got him. That was him. But how common is that? Because that feels like that's
bolting
the way
out of
to kind
nowhere.
Get around like maybe
It's-
isn't so great.
It's
you know?
pretty common because they get away with it, and that seems like it's bolting out of nowhere. When you're like, it's not out of
Where
nowhere.
did that
They've
come
just
from?
they've just learned to
Right.
mask or keep them down.
And then it's like a pin drops.
And mostly flooding results in sensitivity to the world around them, hypervigilance. So mostly flooding does not work. But here's a little catch.
Hang on 1 second too, and the other thing is that a lot of times different things that look like it's the horse's issue, like spookiness, is not actually spookiness.
Yeah, it's a symptom.
It is a symptom of the fear of what might happen next. So they like, I don't know what that word is even, but they act like it's their own bad self-fulfilling prophecy. Because they're actually afraid of the response of the human, because they know that when they spook, it's going to be a problem.
So they start going, oh, that tub looks a little weird. Uh-oh, now my rider's going to chop me in the mouth. You know what I mean? Because then the rider gets
Whether
bracy.
intentional or unintentional.
Yes, right. And because, right, a horse bolts, you can't help but try to grab something. You know, But I think that, and here's a little thing that's interesting to know. They do use flooding with humans. But the flooding with humans, like somebody who won't go on an airplane, that next step is a big one. You can get on and off the plane all the time. So that plane takes off, and they're not turning around for you. You know, so they will use it. But the thing is, the human is an active and willing participant. They know where they're going. They've worked up to it with a process to get there. So that it is, so I think that sometimes it can be looked at from the human aspect, but the horses, any animal, isn't necessarily somebody that said, yeah, I'm in for that. You know what I mean? But there is a point we get to that next level, like driving that trailer is just big. I don't care if you drove it 5 feet. You know, it moving, they're in, I'm all good, and then it moves. Even though we can stop and get them back off, it's just a certain amount where we have to go that extra piece, but we try to make it small enough and do what we can to break it down. But going to a parade is not that. Yes?
Marla's question, what about bringing up the idea of heart? Because most people want a horse that has a lot of heart. But if you are doing flooding, you're basically waiting until the horse gives up, and you're taking away that heart, which is exactly opposite of what most people, particularly a lot of cowboys, really want in their horses, which is a horse that has a lot of heart.
I think they don't
Yeah,
even
I do.
recognize it as a struggle.
Yeah, and also in one of these situations, it was a trainer, and she's doing this to client horses. The clients want a safe horse or the result. So it, in a lot of ways, it was the professional pressure to get results, not really worrying about, and it was this particular situation was around feet. So I don't think people think, oh, we're gonna have heart in picking
Yeah.
up her feet. So there's like these little areas I run into where I'm like, how do you manage this particular? I agree with you.
Right.
You're teaching the horse to give up.
Yeah, but if your client is like, hey, I have a safe horse.
They want a safe horse, yeah.
And they can't see it otherwise.
I don't think learned helplessness is a commonly known.
Right. It's a common thing that happens, but
Right, I think they think, oh, look, he's calm.
my granddad's horses, they were good horses. Man, I got good horses. And it's ironic, he's a psychiatrist and neurologist. And you're like, well, too bad you can't see that. But, it's a different day and age. You know who got this science out of textbooks and really got it out to the world is the marine mammal community. Because they're the ones that took it and put it into a practical application. So, you have Bob Bailey who started doing it with pigeons and the CIA. And, but it's a marine mammal community who took it out of textbook and started putting it into the practical application. When I first went from the marine mammals to the show jumpers and everybody say no, so I didn't do anything. And then I called a man named Tom Dorrance. So I called him on the phone and I just looked up his phone number. I called 411 because you didn't have internet then. You had to call 411, Tom Dorrance in Solvang or wherever he was. And he was one that understood food is powerful. I don't know how to get rid of the food. I don't know how to feed the food. I don't know how to create heart out of the food. I don't know any of that. So I think that a lot of times people will describe that. You'll see so many people they just kind of put the horse's emotions aside and they don't truly see it because it's been normalized. This has been normalized. You hear a 6-year-old on a horse and you hear people saying, hit him, kick him. If you stepped out of that environment for a minute and thought, I would say, hey, your little brother, hit him, kick him. He's not going. That's just not what we would do. But we have normalized it. So we don't see necessarily what we can look at as trauma. So, and I think what's really interesting too, when I first started talking, so my ex-husband was a Grand Prix show jumper and he, ridden to George Morris, all the big stuff. And when I first started talking the training with him, and he said, all the best horses have heart. And I said, well, what's heart? And he said, well, it's this, they're going to be there for you. They're going to, go the extra distance. They're going to be a true partner in this. And I said, well, that sounds like attitude. He said, yeah, I guess so. And I said, we can train that. And, but it was kind of looked at as some fluke. You either got it or you didn't, not necessarily that you can actually shape that process. So I think that, and that's what John Madden said at the beginning of that one video that was the original video, which is in the membership, which you guys may or may not have seen. But he says it gives horses heart. This is how you can give horses heart, because he starts seeing it that it gave horses heart. It gave horses try in the arena that had nothing to do with the actual literal training of that behavior. Does that make sense? Did you have a question? You had a question.
Well,
Ellen.
I just, three things if I could.
Absolutely.
One thought, because, well, number one, this is a huge topic. Obviously, it's touching us all, and I struggle with that question all the time. You know, and just listening to you, sometimes I think a wondering question is helpful, and you were talking about, come back with a question, well, what if you could get the results you're looking for and have a horse that wants to be in the parade, that enjoys being in the parade, that is, happy to be there and happy to go and happy to get on the trailer. I mean, what if, So that's just one thought. And I know, watching a young man who had his grandfather's horse in one of our round pens, and I look out the window and see him doing his little Monty Roberts thing, which he's so proud about, because he read the book, which is huge, actually, for this young man, with his little flag, and I was like, so and I knew he needed to get this horse on the trailer for his grandpa, so I just walked out, and I'm like, oh, hey, look, you want me to just get him for you? And he just stopped, and I just walked up and held his horse, because I had a different relationship with him, because I'd been doing a few things with him when they were looking, so there's that, what if you could do this and have a horse want to get on the trailer? But anyway, so that, just one thought, and then two, I just wanted to acknowledge your story and thank you. I mean, I know you shared it before on videos and stuff, and I value it so much.
Aww.
And its connection to the trauma of the horses, and I just want to take a moment to thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you.
And then thirdly, I just wanted to go back to the horse that you worked with, the mare of the three that you worked with, and that got worse. And I have an Amish cart horse, and when we got her, she was perfect, auction, because they don't like her foals, whatever. And we let her be for a while, and the perfection soon disappeared when the farrier showed up, and I had to walk out with an actual halter, because I've been working with her at Liberty and letting her I knew she needed to decompress. And when I walked out with an actual halter and rope in my hand, and she flew to the other side of the arena and put her butt to me, and I'm like, okay, wow. And have now let her go for a total year out in the pasture, and it took her that long. I mean, she got mean, she got nasty, she got everything. I'm like, you for a while. We'll be here when you're done. And now she turns and comes and finds me. But I've got there's a Facebook group, ex-Amish horses, and this is not about bashing the Amish.
Right.
However, over and over again, it's that over flooding.
Yes.
To get these perfectly frozen horses that will do anything for anyone, and then some nice lady buys them, and when they get tossed to auction, and gets them 2 weeks later goes.
Yeah.
and it's that, and so there's, and I'm always like, Shawna, she's fine. So I direct everyone.
I like the
that
ding.
group, to that, and just because they're freaking out. This horse is nothing like the horse I bought, nothing, and it's like, because
you're
allowing them to be themselves for a minute, it will pass, but it's just so interesting.
And you think about, the Amish go back to that beast of burden. You know what I mean? They don't have they can't say, Millie said no today. Yeah. Millie, I've never used that as one of their names, but Millie, they have to kind of go, you got to do it. We got to get to market. We got to do this. And I think there's truly their own disassociation from the emotions of the horse. Yes. So I try to, again, recognize that they're doing the best they can, and they can't even feel it because it would be too uncomfortable. They have cognitive dissonance, I think, in a large part, because that's
among them, so I have great respect for them. And
yes, and we can all still do better.
Yeah.
And thank you I'd like to share the story, and I think that the first time I told it was in the UK, and we all cried, and I don't know what possessed me to, but I kind of felt like it is what it was part of my horse journey. It's part of what horses go through. It's part of what so many people go through. And what good is it if we can't kind of help people to not feel alone? or to not have it shouldn't be I think the stigma of it is part of what led to me being stuck there. Nowadays there's more organizations and things. Like, where's my mom going to go with her 2 kids? Back then, nowhere. There wasn't, nobody talked about it. So I think now the more we get, the more we know, the more we can go, okay, well, let's grow past it. Let's realize it's there. Just like recognizing our shut down horses. That we got to recognize that they are shut down, and not in a bad way, that they're flooded, that they're reactive, that they're bolting out of nowhere, and that it comes from something, so that we can, so I think it's kind of all that awareness. Questions? Yes?
I was just going to say that I've noticed with the positive reinforcement compared to traditional training or even natural horsemanship training, it does require a lot of awareness about ourselves.
Yes.
Which is really particularly uncomfortable.
Yes.
I would say most of us probably.
Uh-huh.
And then like you mentioned the guilt and the, when feel like you're being accused of doing something wrong or bad, it's obviously very off-putting, like
Yeah.
into that. But I have noticed with like a lot of my clients when I'm kind of starting to educate, it also requires so much more education, I feel like.
Yes.
Because there is a lot of science. And
Right.
there's a lot of emotional implication in like what we're doing in any ways, but now we're bringing light to it and we're bringing attention to it.
Yes.
And I think that's where it gets a little bit hairier.
I
Because
agree.
It's very involved, and you also need, it's not like a send your horse to the trainer and send them back.
Right.
Because
It's
the
not a carburetor.
environment is part of it, and the handling and the daily
Yes.
minute stuff. So it is, I think, at a very different shift from like, again, oh, this colt needs a 90-day start. It's like, no, well, we're not going to send them to the positive reinforcement trainer for the 90-day start because the environment they're coming back to isn't aligned
Yes.
with the start that they're getting. So I do think there is a pretty significant middle ground, which I
Yes.
know is something we're working towards, like with the Horse First Show series, like trying to sort of give people a bridge into this world, essentially.
Right.
And
A better understanding
yeah,
on
and
their own
also,
terms.
Yeah, give like literally a bridge to like walk across versus like, well, here you are, like you're thrown into the deep end, and like we're just gonna click and treat till we get you through this. You
Yeah.
know? The people through it basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've noticed a lot that it is, from a trainer standpoint, there's a lot more work on our end
Mhm.
to educate and to involve the owners.
Yes.
Or the barn manager or whoever it is, which is great
Uh-huh.
because it's needed, I think.
Right, right.
But yeah, that is certainly like, I think
Challenge.
it is a challenge.
And I think that you're like, one of the things that we do when we start, like when I would get those people that years ago would say, I'll do whatever crazy thing you've had, I've tried everything. And they're almost rolling their eyes at me like, wacky, whale lady, whatever, I'll try it. And I'd say, okay. And I said, but you need to be involved. So, okay, but I'll try anything because I've tried everything. And then, so you would kind of, that you required that. I required that they kind of need to understand and be involved and do their homework a little bit, which is simple. They just had to go keep its head away. And it wasn't hard stuff. But then you'd see them saying, wow, he's really smart. And you're like, they all get the target that fast. But you're like, I'm really, really smart. And then the other component is a lot of times when we do lessons, like let's say it's an hour lesson, we do a little piece and then we have a break in between, which gives us a chance to talk between the next session, the next segment. So it kind of gives you a chance to break in there and go, okay, and this is what we're doing and why we did it and what we saw, and let's try it again. And so sometimes building in the little breaks in there, which can easily be filled because they oftentimes want to tune out at that part. They're like, whatever. I don't want to do, but and there's a time that you're kind of like, okay, maybe this isn't for you. If you're not going to want to be really listening and interested in this part, maybe this isn't for you, and so when do you cut that, even though it can be hard on the horses? You know what I mean? There's time where you're like, this is what the horse needs, but if the person's not going to do it and be part of it, then they don't have the right, kind of ethos behind them already. And I think the more we get going, the more we can educate people about that there is a way to do it that's highly effective. And this is where we say, slow down, you go faster. In the beginning, we're going to keep you to yourself, and people are like, 90 days looks good, you know, but in the long run, you have a problem solver. You have a horse who's like on, and I tell this story too, that Minty learned, it was John Abeezy's horse, and he was an off the track, or no, it wasn't even off the track, he's just a thoroughbred, John bought. I started working with him, it was a year and a half, he didn't know anything, he was the first horse to be brought along with positive reinforcement, truly positive reinforcement. And so he, got all the thing, and they said, you're gonna bring him along, and I'm like, I've been riding 2 years. But I was like, okay, I'm game. But anyway, as we went along, he learned everything positive reinforcement. All his behaviors became classical conditioning was part of it, where he's like, oh, I love canter. I don't know why. It makes me feel good. I love being asked for the trot. I love to be asked for the whoa. And it was all just super light and responsive. And then one day, a gal came visiting us, and she was from Texas, nothing, that's just more cowboys per capita. And so she comes and she brings her cattle dog, and that's all fine. She wanted to ride Minty. Okay, no problem. She's not having a click or anything. She doesn't even have food on her. But she can just ride Minty, because Minty by now is like, oh, I love all this. I don't need food to do this. And as he was doing it, then her dog, she just got started. Her dog came in the ring to kind of be with her. Well, he started behaving like a cattle dog, which he's trying to herd Minty, the 16-3 thoroughbred. And he's very sensitive. And she now starts riding him like a cattle horse. She starts weighting the stirrups and riding and doing the extreme back and forth. He goes like this. That's what he knows. Little reins down low, and all of a sudden I'm horrified, because I'm like, whoa, that he doesn't know that. He doesn't like that. He doesn't, I didn't even know if he liked that. But then I slowed down a minute and I looked at his expression, and his expression was merely like, okay, there's an answer in here somewhere. He wasn't offended by it at all. That didn't light him up in any bad way at all, because he just thought, I'm problem solving, but he didn't have a history of triggers with that either. But so when I saw that, I thought, okay, settle down, human, because I'm more upset than he is. And, then I thought, okay, well, good to know. He can, and that was creating that resilience. But I think that, kind of wanting to help people to recognize that we can create that resilience and have a problem solver. And this is when it goes faster, because instead of him panicking first and us having to settle back down, he just was like, I'm going to figure this out, and lickety split. And, he would have been like, okay, I got it, and done the thing if he had half a chance. But she was yelling, and the dog got out of the ring, and it all settled down pretty quickly. But that's what we want, is a problem solver, a happy problem solver. And I think that kind of, as we recognize that in the long run, while it seems slow in the beginning, and this is where people talk about show horses, that I think the biggest part of a show is going to the show. So people train them to jump the course or do the test or run the pattern, and then they go to the show and the horse is like, wow, I don't know any of my stuff. And then people think, well, he doesn't, they think he's being bad or whatever. But really what they don't recognize is that whole environment has him not even able to think about his job, because he's triggered by all the parade, all the things. And we can easily get them ready for that. But it takes a little time. Henley went to a show. She's been to 2 shows now. We just walk around and I click and feed with a target and stuff, not exactly fitting into the crowd, but that's a way that I can get her ready for that environment. So by the time we're ready to ride there, she's like, yeah, okay. And she actually loves the environment. You can tell pretty quick. She's like, what is that? I want to go into that area. And you're like, okay, slow down, sweetie. So I think that all of it to say it takes more work to get them there, but in the long run, it's going to go faster and better and have heart and have try and resilience.
And it takes more work, it takes longer, and in 5 years, they're not back looking for another 30-day fix. And
Yes.
I think that's that missing piece of, well, it isn't as fast as your, bolt breaking, and it's more, but it lasts longer. It
Right.
lasts through
It's
the thing.
actually,
Because a lot of the horses that we all get, we're like, they've got all the issues and the traumas and the.
and this is back to Marlo's question, is it training?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like when people just see the results, they may think of it as training, because I had a quiet horse, but the bolting out of nowhere, and I can't deal with this, and I have no resilience, and I can't deal with this, and I can't, then is it really a trained horse? It kind of goes back to your definition. But I think when we get very goal driven versus emotion driven, we can say, yeah, that horse will walk, trot, canter, get on a trailer, and it looks trained. But we're like, but inside we have a calamity happening. You know, we have a horse who is shut down, and I think if we always are looking at, we want our horses to thrive, to not exist, not to serve us, but to thrive, then that means we have to set a different bar for what is training, you know, and what are we looking at. So it's definitely a process. Good question. Okay, Jesse, you want to take it from here?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're gonna get into groups. We're gonna work with 3 different horses, and we are going to have, I don't know how many that means for a horse. Maybe we just go down the row and count by 3, so that you know what little team you're on.
And you three are going to be helping the groups.
Yeah, but we're still gonna, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
1, 2,
3, 1, 2, 3.
what did you say? 3, 1, 2.
Okay, so that's your group. And then we're gonna get horses, and we're gonna talk about their emotional state. So what are you observing? And do you have something for them to write on?
I do,
Okay.
and I have pens if anybody needs a pen.
Yeah.
Do we need one per group, basically?
I feel ya.
And we're gonna just talk about what we're observing in their emotional state, from any signs of shutdown, avoidance behavior, what are their facial expressions and body language telling us,
Did they change at any moment in time? Like,
and what could have been the reason that they changed. What signs of relaxation did you see? What else?
right, when did they take a big breath? When did they relax again? When were they better? It's the kind of the changes in between. You know, when I was working with Gus yesterday, and I had some things I was putting together, like, okay, if I face this way, then he was better. And I was like, oh, he wasn't better that way. You know, and so I was trying things, but did it mean it was actually a thing? Not necessarily, but it was up to me to try to pull in that information. This is behavioral analysis. You know, as we look and we look at behavior, what it's telling us. And so this is kind of the part we have to do constantly. Even every time we bring out our horses that we already know very well, we're still saying, well, how are you today? And what are you going to do today? So all of this that we were kind of talking about, this kind of sensitivity, or this recognizing what they're telling us, they communicate. Okay, here's a good example, is in the herd at Jesse's house, Hadley is they're matriarchal mares. You know, there's multiple leaders in a herd, and they're typically matriarchal mares. But they're not leaders that are out there saying, you follow me. They're just like, I'm going to go over here. We talk about the ethology of the horse, they're very cooperative. There's not fighting. There's not, I mean, their breeding season is going to have, or resource guarding, but by and large, they're very cooperative. If they have some bully in their herd, it's going to take away from the safety of looking out at the rest. So that kind of idea of the alpha and all that, that's archaic, and it comes from the dogs and blah, blah, blah. And from wolves, really, but that's not really a principle. So as Hadley would do things, she is kind of the upper of them. And if Hadley was standing by the gate and she went like that with her lips, the other horses would step away. Not panicky. You know, they weren't like, look out, she's going to kick, but they'd be like, she just wants a little space. And that is the kind of small stuff they're looking for, is this little stuff. When we see the big stuff, this is big stuff that typically, unless they're breeding, it's coming from resource guarding and human environments. So we are human resources that feel valuable and commodities that feel. So, but to recognize that little twitch of a lip was Hadley's way of saying, I need a little space. And they said, I hear you, and I'm going to do that. This means when they do little things like flare their nostrils or get their little lips square or tint their eyes, those are all actually pretty big communications that we typically, with traditional training, don't stop and go, that was really loud. I hear you're talking to me. We think they're talking to us when they did, you know, when they struck at us, or, you know, they reared, or you know, it's when it's really big. So we're kind of just now trying to break it down and dial in on those little tiny things, so that we can kind of recognize where they are and what might be in play, and just be observing. And sometimes it doesn't mean we stop everything, but we observe and say, okay, like if I went out to the paddock and Henley's out there and I'm carrying this big noisy bag of stuff and Henley looks up and then she says, oh, it's my crazy human, and goes back to eating, she's okay. But she kind of goes up and she stays up and then she goes, I'm going to realize we're starting to go over threshold. It doesn't mean I have to stop everything, but it does mean I need to recognize it. Maybe I put the bag down and bring her to the bag or whatever. But so it doesn't mean we stop everything, but we need to take that in as information for us to make our decisions at how we may go forward. And if they're going to be heard, if we're going to have a voice, then they need to be able to communicate in those teeny tiny subtle ways. That makes sense, everybody?
I have a question.